what I wanted to do was to walk through the Ceph demo. And so I'll show you how that works. We'll give some background in how Crowbar actually operates, Crowbar 2 operates, not spending quite as much time with what makes Crowbar 1 and Crowbar 2 different, but there'll be things we touch on. And the way I like to do this is, because the demo takes about 20 minutes and the explanation takes about 20 minutes, is I interweave them both. So okay. What I want to do is actually start the demo prep going, and then we'll talk through what's going on in the background. Mm-hmm. What I have here is, this is my machine. Let me open a new tab. And then I've run this demo a couple of times before. What basically it is it just runs the Crowbar smoke test framework. Okay. And what that does is it actually builds a complete environment. So it takes an ISO I've built before. So just like Crowbar 1, we start with a base ISO and we install everything. We're actually talking about making some changes to streamline that. And so it'll basically install a full data center in front of our eyes, which is really sort of fun. The first one it has to do is it brings up the Crowbar admin server. And what that does that's very different than this old Crowbar is old Crowbar would actually build all of the OpenStack, all of the Crowbar infrastructure, during the install process. Crowbar 2 is really different because we got feedback that was not flexible. So what Crowbar 2 does is actually just brings up a database and a web server, so the base infrastructure for Crowbar. And then it'll actually, when I'm not in wizard mode, it'll actually stop and then let you make selections and choices so that you can change your networking, you can set up Ceph or not, and all those things. And so that's been a really significant change with this, and something we really heard from the field was that people want to be able to influence all their choices right from the start. So Crowbar does a lot less, and then it bootstraps itself, which is really fun to watch. And we'll get to actually watch it go through the process. This is the boring part because it's just installing the base OS. So this is a good place to come back and say, let's talk about what Crowbar does behind the scenes. And so this is the modified what Crowbar is slide. And there's a build. I actually prefer to just show it all and then do it. So a lot of things aren't that different, right? Crowbar still has the concept of setting up a Pixie server where you boot. The thing that's really different is that in the past, that sledgehammer image had a lot of logic in it. And in Crowbar 2, what we've really done is we use this SSH as a control plane for things. So what we'll do is we'll bring up a base OS. That base OS will talk to Crowbar and say, I exist. And that's about it. Once it does that, and it sets up the keys so that the Crowbar admin server can talk to it. And the Crowbar admin server will go in, connect to that box, and then start executing scripts on it. Okay. The first thing it does is it actually sets up the Ceph client because it uses Ceph to do most of the work. So we don't want to use
Ceph client on the target, right?
On the target. Yeah. But if you're bootstrapping the Crowbar system actually SSHs into itself to set up all the components that it needs.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so you could conceivably turn that whole infrastructure sort of on its head and point it at a new system and have it bring up Crowbar on the new system. Okay. Or at least bring up the data center infrastructure.
Okay.
Crowbar itself, Crowbar 2, is much simpler. It's really a database and a web server. So when people ask me about how you make Crowbar HA, it's a database and a web server, which is very simple to make HA. You create a clustered database, you create a load balanced web server, and you're pretty much done. There's a little bit more to it because there is background processing in Crowbar. So, and that wasn't true with Crowbar 1. Crowbar 1 did basically everything in the foreground as part of the web requests. Crowbar 2 has a significant background element of things that keep working when stuff is happening. We hid that in Crowbar 2. What happened in Crowbar 1 is that as things happened, it would keep making web hits back into Crowbar, into the server, and that those web interface hits would effectively advance the state machine. Okay. We don't do that at all with Crowbar 2. Crowbar 2 actually has background threads and advances the state machine on its own. And so it's a much more sophisticated model. And the way that works is there's the database. I've been talking about that a lot. And then there's a component called the annealer. And the annealer is really the heart of Crowbar. It's really, to me, what the real brains of the system are. But it's important to note that we didn't make the annealer super smart. Our goal was not to make Crowbar brilliant. What we wanted to do is make Crowbar reliable and scalable.
Okay.
And so the annealer's job is to really orchestrate the deployment as in a late-bound way. So it's what happens is when you take this deployment, and I have some pictures somewhere down in here. There's a good one. It's actually an old version of OpenStack, and you can already see how complex OpenStack was. So much more complex now. And so the idea is that as you want things to go in the deployment, you actually have to deal with all these interconnected pieces and parts fitting together. And that's literally what we did with Crowbar. So what Crowbar does is it breaks each one of these pieces. Crowbar 1 was similar, but we really extended the metaphor, and breaks each one of these things into a role. And then the goal of a deployment is to break all these roles, these discrete services that you have to build, into a system, an interlock system. And for us, that includes RAID and BIOS, the OS, the networking. So all those are all what we call roles. And actually, it's time to jump back over and show you this. So this is the VM. I'm going to bring up the web server. The Crowbar web server should be up at this point in the deployment. So we'll do this here. So this is the Crowbar web server. It's not quite up yet, so it's still doing some installs in the background. And make this big enough that you will be able to see it without any trouble. So it should come up in just a second. So let me flash back then to this page. So what's going on here is that we're just booting that first node, and what will happen is that the Crowbar infrastructure will bring up that website. That website will then let us start building up the first roles, and that's really what the first thing is. So we found from a lot of customer experience,
and the roles are the BIOS of the target, or the RAID of the target, what are the configurations that the target requires?
Great question. So roles are basically anything that you can express in the system as a need that you have, something you have a dependency on. So it can be a RAID or BIOS configuration, it could be an operating system install, it could be a database, it could be a library that you need to be successful.
So not necessarily just configuration, it's more, it's bigger than that.
And that's why I like to call them services.
Yeah.
But they take on a lot of different things for us. So, for example, in building up a data center, because that's really Crowbar's building a full data center, you have to have NTP, you have to have DNS, you have to have a DHCP server, you have to have networks. So roles actually express all of those things. And it's actually even more subtle than that, because a DNS server is actually the DNS server, but it's also the DNS client, and it's also the DNS database. So you have the server, you have the database of things in the server, and then you have the clients that attach to that DNS server. And so we actually have roles that do each one of those things. Okay, and it's important to understand it. And then what that does is the dependencies between roles create a graph, and then the annealer's job is to resolve the graph. So what happens is we build up all these interconnected dependencies as a huge mess, and the annealer's job is to take each one of those dependencies and basically bake them in, sort of resolve them down into their pieces. And so what the annealer literally does is it will take one action, figure out if there's any upstream requirements that haven't been met, and if there are unmet requirements, it pushes that into the background. If it can work on it, it has a queue of threads that it can process. And so that work gets done. And this is actually what's really fun, is because we visualize this in the UI. So it should be there. So here's the UI, and what you'll see here is we haven't even built the first node yet, so it's still plugging through in the background. And from this perspective, we actually have, this is an automated install, so I don't have to push any buttons until I get to the Ceph deployment. But here, what I have is the wizard that somebody would see if they were deploying Crowbar in a regular way. And what you can see is that there's different roles that I need. DNS, I have to have a DNS server, I have to have an NTP server, I have to have my network server, which is actually the interface mapping. I have to have Ceph. This actually goes away in a recent commit. We don't require a Ceph server. We use Ceph, but we don't require the server. And then in a minute, it's actually going to build the first network. And so what will happen is when it builds this network, this is where it determines what the administrative connections are. what your admin network. So
Yeah.
if you're used to Crowbar 1, people would talk about the network JSON, and they'd be shedding tears and tearing their hair out. That's gone. What we did was we broke that into discrete pieces, and here Crowbar doesn't need set up anything yet. So all that network JSON pre-configuration stuff is gone. You can just do that right from the start. And so what it'll do is it'll actually build this network for us, and so you can see it did. In this case, it just used our default networks.
Okay.
So this is an overlay for that role relationship, and it's saying my admin network is this, my host network is this, and do that. And then it actually built an admin server. This is a dev tool, so it calls that, and it picks it randomly, but in this case it called it bork, bork, bork. And then it actually has a queue of work that it has to do. So it automatically created that first server for us and started doing work. So all this work got defined, and it's actually trying to set up the Ceph server right now. That's what that top transition is. And then after the Ceph server is set up, then it can start the next thing, which is setting up the network, and then it has a whole queue of work. This is just one system. So one of the things that's amazing about Crowbar 2 is that we've really taken the system and broke it into very discrete parts, which was one of our things. We really wanted to improve transparency of operations for Crowbar. And so what happens is we're literally building bootstrap, just like we used to do. We're bootstrapping the system, but now you can watch it. And there's a couple of views for this. One of the views that I like to use a lot is this one. And right now this one's pretty simple. So this takes all the roles. So the roles are across the top, these column headings. And these are all the roles. They're in roughly requirement order. So it's going to go from left to right for this server. It's going to get more fun when we bring in the next servers, because at that point it'll start doing it. But what's happening is it's literally building all the services that you need to run a data center. It's setting up the network server. It's going to set up DNS servers, NTP, logging, provisioning. So all these capabilities are going to go, and what you're going to watch happen is it's going to slowly click through doing each one of these actions, right? And this is the annealer in operation. We've created some other views for this because this isn't the only way that people want to visualize it. This is actually another view that shows a functional view where you can say, okay, I'm actually building up my system. So when we add Ceph, it's going to add applications and services because Ceph is going to come in.
And this is system overview per node, right?
This is actually for all of the nodes together.
Okay.
So this is an aggregate view of everything. So each one of these little dots
equals a node.
Equals that node. And then so this intersection that I'm showing you is what we call the node role. I have trouble clicking on these from my VNC client. Sorry. So in here, so what's happening is these are all the roles that I need to apply on this node. And when I get more, so the dots are actually what we call node roles. It's the intersection point. It's where this capability is pinned. And one of the things that's really nice is that I can drill into this and I can see all the data. And even more importantly, I can see all the logging. Yeah. So one of the things that is really important, so I can see, all right, this is what happened first, this is what's still coming, and then I can actually see some log output. And if something went wrong, this will actually give me an option. There'll be a retry button. I can try and fix the problem and reassert. Compared to what Crowbar 1 did, this is a dramatically improved situation. So it's much more rational for somebody, and you can see there's a retry. This retry shouldn't actually be here unless there's an error. This light would turn red and it would tell me if there was an error. So at this point, for this deployment, I'm almost done. As soon as I finish, the system's going to kick in and provision more nodes, and we'll get to watch those things happen. And then for the Ceph deployment, we'll actually get to build a network and add a deployment and do some of the things. Right now, I'm about to build a wizard for Ceph, but like the bootstrapping screen. But until we have wizards, it's actually sort of fun to see the pieces and parts that you actually need to have to build. Interesting. Okay. It's sort of fun to do this. And so the way Crowbar works is that it doesn't boot directly into the target OS. It boots into a discovery system. So we call that discovery image Sledgehammer. Sledgehammer is going to, that's where we configure the RAID and BIOS. That's where we can do diagnostics. It's also where we collect inventory about the system. So Crowbar's workflow is boot discovery. If it doesn't know about a node, it always boots the discovery image. We're actually right now coding bypasses so that if you already have nodes, you could bypass that, which is sort of fun. And that's important for things like Docker and other containerized or VMs in the cloud, things like that. But what happens is after you boot that discovery image, then we do a certain amount of work on it. You'll see that happen in just a minute with the Crowbar system after it boots. And then we have to go through and actually do the OS install and then apply the same rules to the OS. So if I jump over here into my system deployment, and the system deployment is specifically for handling node discovery. So these guys are booting this installed image. While we wait for that, I'm gonna tour one or two other things that are worthwhile. So actually, I'm gonna come back to this. First thing I want to do is create a new deployment. So I'm going to create a deployment to hold our Ceph work. So another major difference between Crowbar 1 and Crowbar 2 is that we actually have a scoping boundary for deployments. So we heard really strongly, hey, I want to have a OpenStack deployment or two OpenStack deployments, or I want OpenStack and Hadoop side by side, and I don't want them to crosstalk.
Okay.
Or two Hadoop deployments, right? You might have a lab and a production. So, the idea here is a deployment's actually a scoping boundary where you can put things that don't have to crosstalk. Okay? And so from that perspective, what I'm going to have is once I have my nodes come in, I'm going to put my nodes. I can't. The system deployment's only for discovery. You can't edit it. So if I want to create a Ceph deployment, I actually have to create a deployment to hold Ceph.
Yeah.
And then I start doing work for it. So in order to do a Ceph deployment, what I need is, I need a deployment with nodes in it. So we'll do that in a second. We're waiting for the nodes to get discovered. And I need a network. So in this case, I have to have a network called Ceph.
Sorry, at this point, this is doing multiple nodes at the same time now?
I'm doing 4 nodes.
So the first one, got it.
And they'll all come in about the same time.
Yeah, okay.
They're not staggered. So I'm going to put my Ceph network in my Ceph deployment. So those have to get tied. It's actually building a role, right? Everything in Crowbar 2 is roles.
Yeah.
So this actually builds a role, and then I need to tell it to use a special conduit. So I don't want to use the same network, so I'm using my 1G2 network, which is a separate. The way Crowbar works, and actually I have a slide for this, is because when you're actually building physical hardware, the NIC enumeration is not consistent. We created an overlay so that you could write ops programming. So the 1G1, 1G2, 1G3, those actually allow us to abstract, is it teamed or VLANed or bridged or all this confusing variation in hardware. We still have to deal with it, but we abstract it in our programming. So that's what that's about. The thing that's really cool about our Ceph network is I don't actually set any IP addresses. So the admin network, we set some default ranges, but for Ceph, I don't actually set any IP ranges because these are actually IPv4 ranges. And our cookbooks for Ceph are all IPv6. So we're actually going to build a Ceph infrastructure using IPv6 networks, which is really cool because then we can overlay IPv4 on top if we want, but I can test and prove and get all of it working on IPv6 first. It's actually very flexible like that. And that's been one of the powerful things about Crowbar is we've actually put IPv6 in first, and it uses IPv6 as a preference over IPv4. All right, so now we should actually have some nodes. Yep, so our nodes are coming in. Now it's really fun to jump over to the deployments view.
So, but if the customer is actually deploying an IPv4...
Oops, already done.
Oh, okay.
We'll get to watch this come through. So while we were talking, it actually went through and set up everything it needed to do. But I want to.
Because it happened parallelly quite a bit, so.
It does, and I was.
And if the customer does actually want to do IPv4, it's an abstraction layer on top of that, on top of IPv6.
It sets them both up. It sets them up in parallel. So when I defined that network, if I defined an IPv4 network, it would also do that.
Got it.
But I like to show off our IPv6 capabilities. So what I've done is I've gotten a network, I've gotten a deployment. I can actually now come and put the Ceph, these nodes into the Ceph deployment. If I don't do that, I can't actually create any capabilities. So I'm just switching all these to,
It became set nodes.
Yeah, we just moved them into the Ceph deployment. So you'll notice I have 2 deployments.
Sorry, Bork is the local host, right?
Bork is the admin host. the admin server, right? And so I could actually do installs on that too, but as a rule, we don't encourage that. So here's my list of nodes. So this is just like the screen I've been showing you, except it's blank.
Yeah.
So what I have to do is I have to come in and say, okay, well, I want to do Ceph, so I need the monitor, right? I need the blocks. I need the block storage device and the object store. Let's see. So I need the MDS, OSD, and the monitor. So these are the three essential pieces that I need. And this is what's really fun. Crowbar is smart enough. So now what I can do is literally say, oh, I want to pick what things do what in my system. Okay, and this is where eventually we'll make things smarter. Today, we're intentionally forcing you to walk through this process. By the time we release, this will all be wizardized, and you won't get to see these cool views from this perspective. So what I know is I need one node to be my monitor. Actually, I need my monitor on all of them, and then I should just need one MDS. Yep. And then I want my OSD nodes to be over here. So I'll make all my nodes OSD. It's a little bit wonky of a configuration. So hold on. So what I've done is I've created one MDS and three monitors. I think I'm getting these backwards. I can actually go in. It'll fail if I don't give it the right number. So it's okay if I add extra, put different pieces on extra modes. Yeah. But what I've basically done is there's two things that happened that were really interesting. One is I've been able to pick which services I want deployed on which nodes, which is handy.
Yeah.
But then Crowbar was smart enough, you'll notice it actually brought in all these other roles that it needs. So it inspected the graph and it said, hey, wait a second, you need these other capabilities. Now, the other thing you'll notice is that these are blue diamonds. The blue diamonds are proposals. So one of the things we really like from Crowbar 1 and we've kept is this concept of a proposed deployment, which is where I am right now. I'm in a proposed deployment. And then I can mess with this and change it and tweak it and edit settings. And then once I'm done, I can hit commit. When I commit it, it hands it over to the annealer, and the annealer goes through and does its work. So at that point, it's baking up. It can do 10 things in parallel, and it's going through and saying, all right, first thing I need to do in this graph is to provision an OS. Well, the OS provisioner is actually pretty smart, and it says, you know what? These guys aren't ready for an OS. I have to go all the way back and install an OS on them. So this guy's actually just said, hey, wait, you can't do this. You got to go reboot those nodes. And so if I jump over to my system deployment, you'll see these guys they're in an OS discovery mode, or they're getting kicked out of discovery mode. They're going to reboot into OS mode, and then the OS mode has to install all the capabilities, right? It has to attach it to DNS and logging and NTP and all that. So it has to go through this whole graph again, and then it'll come back and finish the Ceph deployment. Okay, and so I can watch it happen from here. I can also go into the system overview mode and watch the same type of progression as it goes through. But you'll notice now, I have a lot more services in my data center, so my functional chart is much more busy, and I actually have applications and things like that. And I can hover over these and see what they actually are. But I didn't touch anything on the nodes. The nodes are going through their cycle and doing all the work that they're supposed to do to get deployed. And then if I look at the annealer, so this is that view when I was only doing the admin server, was pretty small. Now it's actually got a significant amount of work going on in the background as it tries to, as it keeps track of all the things that have to get done. So this is a universal thing. And we right now limit the number of parallel tasks to 10. We could jack that up as we test it. We'll find out what the right numbers are. And then what we also do is we say one thing on a node at a time. So we streamline things singly through a node.
Okay.
Right. So there's only going to be one per node, because we can't have two things simultaneous on a node. That creates problems. But we could do 10 nodes in parallel for activity. So.
I guess planning to do a scale test of like 100 nodes or 80 nodes.
That's exactly. We're actually in progress of doing that. So the couple of things that I would mention, we still have the concept of bar clamps, but they're not as significant for us. We have this concept of jigs that's really important. So if I jump back over to this picture, I sort of jumped over this. So The other thing we heard from customers was really important. They didn't want us to be as closely tied to Ceph. A lot of them don't want to be as closely tied to Ceph. And even if they are tied to Ceph, they want to be much more. They want Crowbar to be separated. And so we introduced this abstraction layer that we call Jig. And so the Jig, there's actually 4 jigs already in the system. One of them is just a straight SSH jig that lets us run scripts. That's how we bootstrap Ceph. We just added another one called Ceph Solo that runs Ceph without a server. We have a Ceph jig which runs Ceph with a server. So there's 2 flavors depending on what if you have cookbooks that require server.
And that's, if you have Jig, you have no reason to keep a Ceph server or Ceph anything off.
It depends on what your cookbooks do. So if your cookbooks require search, you have to have Ceph server for that. Our cookbooks don't require search because Crowbar provides all the information they need, so that we can use Ceph Solo. And what's neat is that when your dependencies call for Ceph server, we run Ceph server, and we'll install the Ceph server and start everything going for that. But that's part of our flexibility, so we can add other capabilities, and you can also interweave them. So it doesn't matter to us if Puppet's doing the work for one role or Ceph is doing work for another role. We deal with the dependency graph to make sure they all do their thing. Now they can still step on each other if you're not careful. We can't police that, but we can do a lot to help protect against that. So in this case, the system role is going to come through, and the thing that's really right now we're installing the OS. You can see that going in the background over here. And once it's done with that, it'll install Ceph Client, and then Ceph Client will take it the rest of the way and keep running through the deployments. We still have the concept of bar clamps, but not as much. So bar clamps for us are still sort of a container for workloads, but the idea of having 100 discrete bar clamps, we're trying to move away from that. We'd like OpenStack to really sort of be one bar clamp, and Crowbar to be one thing. So we heard from people that it was really confusing.
So if somebody had to add support for, say, a new type of NoSQL database.
This is so that is an independent workload, and you could bring in NoSQL as its own thing, just like Ceph is its own thing. And then you might have an OpenStack bar clamp that has a whole bunch of OpenStack capability, but then relies on the Ceph, or optionally relies on the Ceph bar clamp to set up Ceph and then point to it. So we've tried to be really flexible with that. So we're still going to have this concept of independent capabilities, but
that's going to be bar clamps.
And those will be bar clamps. Yeah. But we're trying to rationalize the number of bar clamps to a smaller set, so it's easier.
So basically, but it will depend on the number of workloads. A new workload means a new bar clamp.
Correct. And in some cases, what happens is they start as one bar clamp, and then they would get pulled into other things. Yeah. And so we're that's easy to be flexible on. Yeah. And then so what you can actually see going on in the background is that we're actually rolling through the deployment right now. So this is doing all the system infrastructure. I just installed the OS. Ceph Client is in. It has to do everything else. Most of these things go really fast, so the screen's going to refresh and you'll watch it go. But the thing that makes this screen really powerful to me is that it really shows you that the core of Crowbar 2 is this annealing action where every discrete option is going and you can watch it. So I haven't seen any other infrastructure management tools that give you this type of insight into. We're literally building the data center one service at a time. So once it finishes this, it's going to automatically roll over into the Ceph one. And so the Ceph deployment here is it's already rolled over, and so it finished provisioning the OS, and now it's going through doing the Ceph setup. And because it can do 10 things in parallel, it's actually doing all those nodes simultaneously. It's pretty.
Right now, it's just deployment of the Ceph RPMs, right? At this current point.
It's not only deploying the RPMs, but it's also doing all of the wiring to hook it together. Yeah. And what's cool is because of the way we use Ceph, we're actually using. We started with the upstream cookbooks from Ceph. So unlike previous Crowbar attempts to do Ceph that were basically standalone efforts, this one actually uses Inktank's own cookbooks to do the deployment. And then as that improves, we get the benefits of the improvement. If we find things that we need, we can push them back upstream. And that was another thing we heard very clearly, is that people in our community wanted their cookbooks to be, they didn't want Crowbar cookbooks, they wanted Ceph cookbooks, or Inktype cookbooks, or OpenStack cookbooks. And so we heard that very clearly, and one of the things that we've really added is this. And, from a technical perspective, that's an approach called attribute injection. So not everybody cares about that detail, but if you're in the Ceph community, that actually has a very specific meaning. And it's really the state-of-the-art way to do Ceph deployments. But we're looking at and actively pursuing Puppet integration, so you can use Puppet. I know there's interest in doing Salt.
Doing?
Salt, alternate to Puppet on Ceph. So there's different ways to do this. It doesn't matter to us. Ceph provides this sort of orchestration, and then the jigs abstract that away. So at this point, and I don't have any good way to prove to you that Ceph is deployed. You have to take my word for it.
I trust you.
But Ceph is actually, and we need to build a client or something that I can show you the Ceph pieces. But we actually have all the Ceph pieces in deployed, and we can go in and actually start using Ceph at this point, or connecting it to OpenStack and things like that. I think that covers most of the Crowbar 2 capabilities for this. Yeah, scaffolds are dev infrastructure, and then then one of the things that people often want to ask is, so if I took this, what I can do is, if I wanted to make a change, I could then take. So this is a setup. Setups are not really the goal of Crowbar 2. They're a necessary thing we have to do. What we really are trying to achieve with Crowbar 2 is deployment, or is ongoing maintenance and continuous operations. Right? It's an operations model. And so what we've done here, that's why I don't show this, is I need to expose the hooks where you can actually edit these again. So the idea is that I've got all, this is an intermediate version. So what I've done is I've actually taken that deployment, I move it back into a proposed state, and from a proposed state I can make edits again. So I could actually change, so if I didn't like my configuration, I could actually tweak my configuration, change some values, and then recommit that configuration. And so that process allows me to continually refine my deployment. So that in that case, if I got new RPMs or some guidance, don't turn that on or change this configuration setting, I can make that change and redeploy it. Or if I add nodes, I can add nodes. That's basically this process of ongoing maintenance.
Sorry, quick question here. Go back to the basics here. How do you tell the very first time the admin server is bringing up this slave nodes, I guess, as to no, but it's all DHCP.
Right. So the nodes are going to be, the nodes will be discovered.
Yes.
From that perspective, and we actually get information. This is the node screen, and so the top part is things we've shown in Crowbar 2 in the past, and then the bottom is actually a full inventory of all the things that. It's not a full inventory. It's actually we have a huge inventory of facts that we capture. These are ones that we actually map so that they're accessible from the UI.
Got it.
But that's pretty much it. But yeah, there's flags inside the system that tell you if it's going into discovery or diagnosis. We're actually, some of that code is being refined right now. And then we're building, there's some features that people have asked for a long time beyond scale, which is one of our #1 things.
Beyond scale,
That things like you can actually reserve nodes and say, hey, don't do any work with this node right now. Take it off, and it'll actually work. It'll block the deployment, so that's what the reserve button does. And I'm actually working on a hinting capability so that you can preset IP addresses.
Interesting. Okay.
And the other thing, the long requested feature that I think we're going to get out of hinting is that you can predefine a node name and a MAC address and have it automatically link those together on display.
Got it.
So we're making a lot of interesting stuff coming together as we progress.
Interesting.